My purpose this afternoon is to try to introduce you to the world of contemporary automata. But of course, before I do that, I suppose I should probably explain just exactly what automata are. Simply put, and ignoring all the hyperbole about it, they're just simply mechanical toys. Since they're obviously not for children, I'm often tempted to call them adult toys, but that has an entirely different connotation for the most part. The term automata comes from the word automates, which is Greek, which means self-moving or without human intervention. That's never been altogether true, but it's true enough we'll just have to live with it. I'm going to start by showing you a video clip of a classic piece. What I mean by a classic piece is it comes from the classic age of automata. This piece was made around 1728 by two Frenchmen and is supposedly a portrait of Queen Antoinette, Marie Antoinette, but I'm not sure that that's really true. It's not, as is often supposed, a music box. This is really a figure which actually plays the hammered dulcimer. Now, in the first section, it may look like the hammers are not actually hitting the strings, but that's just because the strings are raised above the soundboard. And in the second little section of this piece, you'll get to see how some of the interior things work. Meanwhile, let's see if we can get this baby to play. Now, the piece was destroyed during the French Revolution, and it was later found by the French magician Robert Houdin, who restored it. Now, the history of automata is so long and rich and full that it probably deserves a lecture all into itself. I just want to touch on a few historical points just to kind of put things into historical perspective. Almost from the very first time people began making three-dimensional objects, they wanted them to move and to imitate life. Now, the earliest examples we find of articulated figures come from the Gravettian period, which is about 28,000 years ago, the time of the mammoth hunters. And since that time, it's been found across all cultures and down through the ages. Now, the first people who made real or true automata were the Egyptians, and they created these statues where the priests could manipulate out of the range of view of the viewers. It could make the little parts of it move so that it looked like it was alive, so that the worshipers would be intimidated and give more money to the temple. Now, the Chinese and Japanese also made automata. In fact, the Chinese made an entire orchestra for the emperor of the Han Dynasty in 300 BC. And later, they made birds with moving parts and mechanical augers that swallowed fish and figures that were begging girls to sing. The ancient Greeks and Romans also constructed a lot of automata, again with the same purpose of intimidating the viewers to give more money to the temple. But Hero of Alexandria was working in about the 2nd century BC and documented all of his works, which were based upon simple scientific principles of hydraulics and pneumatics, that is air and water movement. He wrote it all down, and it was lost, and it wasn't translated until 1500, which completely astounded all the scientists at the time. A lot of you have traveled Europe. You've probably seen these statues in the various bell towers around the European capitals, which move at the time of whenever the clock changes. The figures on the right are from the Glockenspiel, which is in Munich, and they're full size. The figures at the bottom are Morris dancers, which go through these elaborate motions in this dance, and at the top is just a courtly parade. But about 1738, a man named Jacques Boucanson, who was a Frenchman, created a mechanical duck out of gilded copper. Now, Boucanson had already been making figures, 2 of which are seen flanking the duck here, but this duck was different. It was really special. It had over 400 moving parts in one wing alone. And it could walk and quack and eat and digest its food, and in fact, it seemed to be perfect. And of course, that was the problem. People refused to believe that the duck was not real. And the only way he could have done that is he created life in league with the devil. So Boucanson got a little skittish. He had already had 2 flying angel figures destroyed by the Jesuits a couple of years before. So he quickly abandoned making automata, and it all disappeared. And the only thing that's left is an expression from his day, which is, if it looks like a duck, and it walks like a duck, and it shits like a duck, it must be a duck. Then about 100 years after that came the golden age, like the ones I showed you at the beginning there. And these were big, elaborate, and animated figures, predominantly French, were created simply for the amusement of the wealthy. And they were very popular. You know, people didn't have much in the way of entertainment back in those days, but all the factories disappeared when they were turned into munitions factories in the First World War. And that was pretty much the end of the golden age of automata. The favorite subject matter was such things as magicians, and smokers were very big, and then musicians as well. And so we come now to the present day. As I mentioned, it pretty much all disappeared until a bunch of crazy Brits reenacted or re-enabled resurrected, there we go, the whole genre. Now there are a lot of differences between the classic automata and contemporary automata. And in the first part, on classical automata, like the one on the left, it's all done by clockwork. You wind it up, or someone can engage it and stand back, and it moves. On contemporary ones, the viewer has to engage with the piece, interact with the piece, turning a handle or doing something else to activate it. So there's more of an intimate quality rather than just standing back and say, it's magic. On the classical ones, they went to great pains to cover up all of the mechanics and the mechanisms and everything. All the guts of the piece were hidden. So again, it was magic. Nowadays, people like to see what makes them work. So now the mechanics are shown, sometimes even flaunted, in the idea that people like to see that. So, and the other thing that happened is these were kind of mysterious, and everyone was in awe of them. And you'll see in a lot of the contemporary work, there's a lot of frivolity, shall we say, or humor. There's no real attempt to make it look realistic. They're kind of cartoony and oftentimes very low tech. Now it all started with a man named Sam Smith, for the most part, who was a painter in Great Britain, because this is predominantly a British phenomenon. he was working in the 50s and 60s, and he created these pieces that people didn't know what to do with. They weren't quite toys. They weren't quite sculpture. People didn't know how to classify them, and so he had a hard time. The British world in particular was pretty hostile to the notion, and he was much more popular in the United States than he was in Britain. They weren't really automata. They were just kind of simple things that you pulled a couple of strings. It was called a jumping jack mechanism, and certain parts would move. But he was very influential in terms of influencing a bunch of students who were coming out in the early 70s. He said that children's toys are about pretending to be grown up, and my toys are about what it's like when you get there. The focal point of the whole movement was a place called the Cabaret Mechanical Theater. It was established by a woman named Sue Jackson in Falmouth, which is in Cornwall, in 1979. And then she moved it to London, to Covent Garden. And there she converted a bunch of vegetable vaults into this curious hybrid of a museum, gallery, shop, and arcade. And the exhibition was packed with these little machines that responded either to the touch of a button or the drop of a coin, and it was cavernous and dark and dramatically lit. But something else was really new, the slightly off-center way of looking at the world. It was something between British eccentricity and absolute anarchy, with an underlying sense of the absurd. And there were these witty ideas everywhere. Well, sadly, the CMT closed in the year 2000. It's no longer there, but Sue continues to maintain a website and provide information for people and instruct. She puts on traveling exhibitions and serves as a mechanical reference for enthusiasts and collectors and so forth. Now, I wanted to show you a few of the makers, and it's impossible to start talking about contemporary automata makers without starting with Paul Spooner. Paul Spooner his work is so prolific. I mean, he writes so much of it. And it's so pervasive that he's become the epitome of the medium. His work is usually made of painted and carved wood, and it's characterized by witty premises and clever mechanisms and a lovely sense of fun. You might have noticed the skeleton piece in the window of Cabaret, and it's the piece on the left. Here. I'm going to skip that one. The spaghetti piece is his encouraging people to get more out of life. One of his favorite subjects is the Egyptian god Anubis, and for which he's created over 300 variations. And here he's going to talk about why Anubis.
Can I drag you back to Anubis?
Drag me back to Anubis. Well, what? Well, he's this guy with a... He's an anthropomorphic thing, isn't he? I mean, he's like Rupert Bear, I sometimes say, because I can't think of another example. But all these Egyptian things... There's something very funny about it. Of course, in the beginning, the Egyptians used to have all these... The animals were just animals. They didn't have human bodies, but they found it suitable somehow, because they weren't very good at drawing, I think was the answer, to make them just animals' heads on human bodies. And it gives those paintings of theirs a kind of continuity and sense, because some of those things are ibises and whatnot, aren't they? And You can't really identify with an ibis god. It's better to give them the sort of body as well.
Why does Anubis appeal over the others then?
Over all the other Egyptian ones? Well, I did in a sort of fairly bloody-minded way think I would work my way through all the Egyptian gods, but I got onto Sekhmet, the lion-headed god, and realised that none of them was a patch on Anubis for speed of manufacture, mainly. That was, and strangeness, funniness, and the potential for development of longer and thinner ears and noses. I mean, there was within the still being recognisable. So I think that I stuck with him out of pure laziness or some kind of inertia, or perhaps it was sensible to stay with him. But this one was going to be part of a series of Anubises doing healthy things. And I thought it wasn't going to be a terribly exciting item, but I do now find it fairly thrilling, really, the way this little joint here works. The movement is lifting these like that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a little bit of friction there that causes that joint to close up first and then go down. It's just a bit of lost motion being taken up. It was pretty well accidental too, of course, like a lot of these things that seem to work out like a good idea. They weren't ever ideas at all, they were just mistakes and accidents.
He says he sees parallels between the plot of a story or a joke and mechanical device, like a spring mechanism that's loaded and then released. It's like the build-up and the punchline of a joke. But he makes these crazy things. For example, the one on the left is called A Quiet Day in the Arm and Leg Shop. I mean, Paul's just got this offbeat sense. This is one of the first pieces I ever bought when I started collecting. It tells the story of the fate of the last dodo being enjoyed by a British ship's crew. It has an incredible mechanism. Now, Lucy Casson works predominantly in lightly repoussé painted tin. And as opposed to Paul's, they seem to have quite a naive quality. She uses very simple and sloppy mechanisms to produce deliberately jerky movements. And every scene is accompanied by clanking and clamoring. And this is called Ronald Reagan's bulldozer. I have absolutely no idea what it means. Andy Hazel also works in tin, which he likens to working with an unfriendly razor blade. His work is fabricated and soldered rather than being repoussé like Lucy's. And they often work together. And they work to produce this particular scene, which is from a big tableau. It was called The Ride of Life. And it's a scene with, they're full-size figures, which have flopping heads, drinking tea, squirting ketchup on their dinner, dogs running around sniffing for scraps, flies being zapped, and all the rest of it. Frank Nelson is a former engineer and industrial model maker. He made a lot of the weapons for the early Star Wars movies. His work is very different. It looks like a 16th century Nuremberg wood carvers, and it's painted in the style of 19th century carousel figures. He mostly does big commissions.
The tamer cracks his whip. The tiger refuses. Again he cracks his whip. Again the tiger refuses. Again he cracks his whip. The tiger accepts and does his trick. If you can put a twist in the tale, always for the better.
This is his interpretation of a classical piece. It looks like a classical piece. Robert Race is a beachcomber, a real beachcomber. His work incorporates driftwood and found materials that he finds on the beach. They have a rather rustic, mystic charm about them and often portray mystic subject matter. Martin Smith, on the other hand, makes pieces which are far more technological. He makes these humorous, macabre figures which are beautifully crafted, but have absolutely no covering of the mechanisms whatsoever. They're fully exposed. Now, Peter Markey is probably the dean of the British makers. He's the mainstay of cabaret, and his pieces he pretty much started the whole thing. His work is always very simple and highly decorative, and it's two-dimensional. But one of the things he's most noted for are his wave machines.
And that coincided with me packing up teaching after 25 years and reaching 50 years of age and wondering how I was going to earn money. So I used to make these static images, and I also made some of them move in a very, very simple way, because I'm not a very good craftsman and I am probably not much of an engineer. But I had very, very simple solutions, which you turn a handle and little cams and levers. Anyway, I found that, in fact, I had to stop making non-moving objects because everybody wanted to buy things which moved. If I was in an exhibition and I was the only one who had a few little machines which you turn handles and they moved, everybody crowds around these things which moved. And they also sold, so it seemed it was a good thing. But one of the first things I made was wave machines. The wave machine is a very, very simple mechanical device which somehow produces a result which far exceeds its simplicity and its technical kind of skill. Up in sequential order so that it gives the appearance of waves. It's just a silly idea to try and depict water, which is very fluid and smooth, by rigid pieces of wood. Because of my limitations, I have to work out mechanisms which don't demand much accuracy, because I find it very difficult to measure accurately. If I have to measure, for example, 10 pieces of wood 4 inches each, it turns out that none of them end up 4 inches. Even if I use a machine, it still doesn't seem to work out that way. I just seem to be brilliant at not being able to be accurate. So all my mechanisms have a great tolerance of inaccuracies, so that even though everything's very loose and everything's not exactly the right length, they still more or less work. But it's all ideas come from working, and if you work on a particular model, as you're working on it, before you're halfway through, you've thought of adjustments and improvements, or how to do something else based on what you're doing already. And if you don't work, no ideas come, but the whole process of work brings ideas. Paul Spoon and myself, every Christmas we used to make little models for each other. Of course, his models to me were far more ingenious than mine to him, but this is one of them, which was, I used to make so many models that he used to imagine that I was like a factory on a conveyor system, so he had these little conveyor belts with all the little type of models I used to make.
Ron Fuller is best known as an automatist, but he prefers to call himself a toy maker. He makes games and clocks, and he has a full-size figure that overlooks a tavern on Trafalgar Square. He often produces life-size figures, and this is his sheep shearing man.
This is the sheep shearing man. As you turn the handle, the sheep shears the man, but right at the end, the shears get him in the neck, and because his neck's a bit tough, you have to have 2 goes to do it, and then his head gets chopped off. Then it falls down like that, and then as you keep turning, so the head comes back on again. And it works with 3 or 4 cams. You have one cam here which pushes the man up like this and then lets him drop quite suddenly. Then you have another cam here which works as scissors, and you can see the cam follower here which is connected to the scissors. Then you've got another cam here which is just a circle with a few notches on it, which makes the head open and looks as though the sheep is sort of laughing.
Now, Matt Smith formed a partnership with Paul Spooner and created the 14 Balls Toy Company, and they worked as a team on many editions. And Paul was usually the one who came up with the idea, and then Matt was the one who made them work. He's a genius with mechanics. His pieces are often brilliant and always beautifully crafted. This is another one of my favorites, and this is one of his, he calls it Writer's Cramp. I always call it the Typing Tiger. He still does occasional additions, but for the most part he is working on big displays for museums and so forth. This is one from the Birmingham Museum. It's a sequence showing how you construct a flintlock rifle. Should you ever be in the UK, you can look all over. His work is usually in museums, and he produces what are called donations boxes, where people put the money in to donate to the museum, and it'll activate a little scene that does something for you. Now, most of these that they show you you have some automata just repeat a certain simple kind of motion, like the wave machine or something that just repeats itself. And the other ones have a certain sequence where you get through a certain storyline and you get to the end of it and there's a kind of a surprise action or so forth. It's kind of like the sheep shearing man. And then there are those which try to tell a little story, a little stage show, and so you have a little sequence of things with kind of a narrative, so to speak. And Neil Hardy's work falls into that category. And he often uses little bits of text here and there, like you see around that green drive wheel, which give you an idea as to what's going to happen. So if you could read that, then you'll see. He always uses a worm gear to control the speed of his pieces. It's interesting, it's a very simple thing. It's just a coil of brass wire. Pegometer tells you what's happening. This one has speech bubbles, but you'll have to read quickly. Oh, that's all right. This is a piece that Paul explains this very strange piece called The Dream, which is a little more like a nightmare.
It's a woman that opens up, and it's not the same as the skeleton, although it was made as a companion piece to the skeleton, in that it's a figure and it opens up. But in this one, the whole trend is upwards, vertically upwards. Downstairs you see a scene of bureaucracy where the aspirants, those people who wish to achieve perfection, are showing their pass books to the men in uniform, who wallop them with their little stamps, and off they go. Thigh doors shut, midriff doors open, revealing a kind of revolving staircase. And mistakenly I thought that you would be forced to see from this spectacle people changing semi-imperceptibly into jackals, and the breasts open up. These breasts represent heaven, the perfect, ideal English lawn. Then it shuts, because that's about as far as I think you can go, really, perfection-wise. The face opens up, shows a fairly sordid little room with Anubis. He looks at you briefly and sees you for what you are, which is a pretty uninteresting specimen like the last one he saw when the thing opened. Looks back at his toes, face shuts, end of the story.
John Grayson also works with tin, which he prints himself, and they look like Victorian tin plate toys, and he uses also simple mechanisms. His pieces, of course, are put together with tabs rather than being soldered, because he'd mess up the plating otherwise. John Lumbus makes small little pieces. This is again one of the smaller pieces that I bought when I first started collecting, and I've always liked this piece, particularly the nose mechanism. And there's the queen. Melly Tomlinson, too, uses, he makes pieces out of copper and anodized aluminum, and she puts them together with very simple mechanisms, just a cam and a couple of rubber bands, and they pedal furiously and look like they're going to fall over. But Peter Lenertz is a plumber by trade, and all of his pieces, therefore, are one of a kind. He doesn't have the leisure to do multiples. This is his homage to come on. Peter Markey, his wave machine. Now, if I had to choose a favorite, which I'm often asked, I'd probably have to go with Keith Newstead. Keith, his pieces are usually made out of burnished metal, and has all the mechanisms very proudly displayed. His pieces are very fanciful, humorous, and all made out of metal. One of his best-known pieces is this dragon, and this is a little shot of him a few years ago explaining how he came up with the mechanism.
The basic idea for the dragon came once again from fiddling around. I developed this spring technique, which I then clad in brass plating, as you can see here, which gives the head movement, the tail movement, all from one rotating rod. By holding the end of the spring and rotating the rod, although the rod's rotating, the other end of the spring remains upright, so by connecting that to a head, i.e. the head of the dragon, you can actually get the neck movement without the whole thing twisting round. And then the jaw can be connected to a offset crank here, which will give the opening and closing jaw movement. So by having the spring actually fixed inside the neck and the end of the wire attached to the head, you get the neck movement and also the tail movement and the jaw movement and the tongue, which is connected to the bent rod, which also twists.
The mermaid uses exactly the same mechanism. Some flyers. Some of us are going to make some flyers pretty soon. He says he likes to have his pieces have a smooth movement with the occasional crash. He says, I don't take myself too seriously. He says, I like automata because they don't fit into the established roles of arts and crafts, and that's the attraction. Douglas Wilson makes all of his pieces out of wire, and he drew his inspiration from the circus animals of Alexander Calder and the wire toys made in a lot of African cultures. He says it's very forgiving to people who are bad at drawing and can be very encouraging to people in children and aging Scottish automata. Anyway, I messed up that thing right now. Ian makes very simple, gentle pieces, but he's almost as good at wire working as Douglas is. This is his little piece called Picking Order. Look at the mechanism on this piece. It's all wire, very simple, very effective. Now, almost all of Tim Hunkin's work is life-sized, and he was trained as an engineer and did a comic strip, and this is
the chiropodist that usually sits outside Cabaret Mechanical Theatre. She's just up here for a bit of refurbishment. She was beginning to look a bit tatty. She's been there for about 4 or 5 years now. And you have to put your foot in the treatment bay, and then you put a coin in the slot. Whoops. She looks down to inspect your complaint. Then she decides what to do. And then the treatment begins. Oh! And although you can't see it, what's actually happening is that there are a load of sort of creepy crawly things that I'm feeling on my foot. And you get some compressed air blown through your foot as well. And that's your 20p's worth. Well, I think what I like best about her is that she's the only machine that I've ever made that makes people scream.
This is one of my less tasteful machines. It's called the Great Chop Hand Off, and basically what it does is it appears to chop your hand off.
Welcome. I am the Great Chop Hand Off. Move your fingers in the gauntlet while I summon up my mystical powers. 1, 2, 3.
This is a life-size piece by Eric Williamson. It's entirely of wood. Philip Lowndes usually works with what's called a Geneva wheel, which breaks the action up into 4 segments. He seems to have a problem with dogs. The one on the left pees on his leg, and the one on the right kind of returns his friendly gesture. This Wanda Sowery makes pieces completely of wood, uses no paint or anything else. She just changes the color of the wood to give different effects. She likes to throw in a little bit of extra movement just for the hell of it. This is a piece of her in the studio, self-portrait of an automaton working an automaton. I like the plane in the background. Simon Venus works with recycled materials for the most part. On the one on the left, you can see it's made out of a scrub brush, a T-ball, guitar strings, pieces of an old pin. The action is just the two beasts pecking each other. The one on the right, which is the bird, when you turn the crank, the bird reaches down and pecks your finger hard. It hurts. Now, while the majority of the automata are British, there are other artists that are starting to become known in other countries. I'll show you a few of them. This is Jan Zalud from the Czech Republic. His work is not very humorous. It's a little strange. He's basically trained as a puppet maker. They're beautifully carved, absolutely gorgeous, but they're not very humorous. In fact, they're a little weird. The one on the left are called Sleepless, for example. The sheep do not jump over the head, they go through the head. And this is a piece called The Conversation. Carlos Zapata is from Colombia, and it comes from the tradition of folk carvings, which are, his work is sometimes full of political or sexual themes. And Malcolm Brooke is a Scot now living in Germany, and he makes pieces that are characterized by these ball gears, which shouldn't work because there's not enough friction, but they do. Pierre Meyer is a Frenchman, and all of his work is of other fellow magicians. And this is one of his pieces of Fechner, who does a levitation act. This is one from a geisha. That does a cup and ball trick, but there's no hole in the table. Kiyo Nishida's from Japan, and his work looks different because he uses a lot of external struts, and which give it a kind of an exaggerated motion. And Eduard Vartsutsky is a Russian immigrant who's now living in Scotland, and his pieces are very dark and political and subversive. He has his own museum in Glasgow called automata, and it's full of machines. That's all you get. We've got to move on. John Morgan is an American. He teaches at Auburn University, and his pieces are beautifully, beautifully made and beautifully carved. This is a little piece. It's called A Turtle on the Fence Post. It's based on a Southern saying that if you ever see a turtle on a fence post, you know he didn't get there by himself. And then there's this guy who plays around with it a lot. Doesn't do much, but he's enjoying himself. My work usually falls into two categories. I don't like to talk about my work very much, but I'm told it's all part of the deal, so I'm doing it. I either make large pieces, which are what I call Mattel size, and I dress them in the classic form of dressed automata. I make them Mattel size so I can steal clothes from Barbie and Ken, so I don't have to make them myself. This is a... And this is a magician with Barbie and Ken's 50th anniversary tuxedo. You can't see the mechanism because after all, he's a magician. It makes change. That's enough. Here's Jack. Hope you're all old enough. Here's the latest one. Just can't get it together. I started collecting in about 1996, and then after about 5 years of studying and trying to figure out mechanics, I started making my own. But anybody can tell you that collecting art is an expensive sort of business, and so this is a portrait by Paul Spooner of some guy from Arizona in his chili shirt, looking at his own price tag. I wasn't too thrilled about being portrayed as bald, however. If you'd like to see more, you're welcome to visit my website. You've all got a handout about this book, and you're welcome to take a look at that. And if you want to do one yourself, there are some take-home paper doll automata. Take one if you think you're going to make one. Leave it if you don't. Anyway, you're all welcome.